This morning on the subway, a guy gets onto our car and immediately launches into the "May I have your attention, please?"
Believe it or not, there's actually a ton you can learn about American politics just from analyzing this clip.
It's 8 a.m., morning commuters, nobody wants to hear this guy talk. He starts with, "We have a massive homeless problem in this city. There are too many homeless people." But then he's like, "Because the US state does not care about us. They will leave you out in the streets to die. You are nothing to them." At this point, I'm looking around at other people who have gone from slightly annoyed to Then he's like, "We live in a surveillance state. We are being watched 24/7. There are drones, there are cameras. There is no privacy. Our lives belong to the state. They purposely keep you stupid in this country. They do not invest in education. They do not want you to know. They do not want you to be aware. The power of the state must be dismantled. It has too much control over our lives." By the end of it, I was looking around at the other passengers on the train. I'd say a good 25% of them were all nodding, just like, this guy's making some pretty good points.
So this TikTok by Frankly Socialist points out the fact that most Americans are pretty willing to accept the idea that our government doesn't work for working class people. But people have a lot of different responses to that idea, and they have a lot of explanations for why that problem is, and they have a lot of theories about how to solve that problem. And so I'm going to break it down because I think it gives people pretty good insight about the different political leanings of the country. So there's really one of three different ways that you can run away with from the idea that the government isn't working for working class people. The first idea is that all states are inherently bad, and they are by definition going to be oppressive institutions. Now, this is something that both anarchists on the left and libertarians on the right believe. Anarchists want to replace the state with more social and cultural institutions that replace the state and serve the interests of the community from a principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their own. Libertarians just kind of want to get rid of the state, but somehow also maintain private property rights, which itself is inherently contradictory because, of course, property rights come from state authority and can only be defended by state authority. But never minding that, they basically have this idea that magically, if we keep everything the same, we keep all this capitalism around and this economic inequality around, but we just get rid of the government, then everything's magically going to get better. And I think we all realize that that's a pretty terrible ideology that fundamentally wouldn't work and would really just hand basically all of the power over to the richest, worst people in society. But then you've got another layer. You've got people who believe that the government is in essence good, but we've got the wrong people in charge. Now, this is something that both liberals and fascists believe, but they have different explanations about who should be in charge and what's causing the problem. Liberals believe that the problem is that there's not enough smart people in charge, that ultimately we just need smarter people to run the government, that the system works only if everybody is some sort of galaxy brain genius. Now, the problem with that is that it fails to recognize the structural problems that exist within our country. You know, the lack of real representation in the Senate and the racism that's sort of built into our system and a litany of other problems, not to mention the whole capitalism thing and the fact that the government itself, as it is today in the United States, is pretty limited in what it actually does to deal with capitalist exploitation, with the poor treatment of workers, and you name it. And that just filling positions of power with smart people is not going to get rid of those problems. Our problem is not a lack of intelligence. It's a lack of willingness to challenge things like white supremacy and its pervasive role within our society. But then, of course, you have the fascists. Now, the fascists, they really love our system of government. They talk about the Constitution literally all the time. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. The United States Constitution was drafted in such a way to basically constantly prioritize the needs of wealthy capitalists and white folks over basically everybody else. I mean, it was a system that was designed by white supremacists after all. Their problem with the system, though, is that they think that the wrong people are in charge. But they push these over-the-top anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about who's really in charge. And they spread this violent, hateful ideology that seeks to eliminate marginalized people from society entirely because they think that the influence of marginalized people is too much, which is really, really telling because marginalized people, I mean, by definition, by the very nature of being marginalized, means that you have less systemic power. So their whole narrative is really ridiculous. But really, it's just this creating of a fictitious narrative where they can claim to be the victims to justify violence against folks. But that's basically what the fascists believe, that our system is being controlled by the wrong people. And I think we all recognize how viciously evil fascism is, and we recognize how overtly racist, homophobic, sexist, you name it, their beliefs are. Ultimately, fascism is a pretty terrible system. And then you've got the third way of looking at this, which is to understand that a state is a tool of class oppression, but that a state can either serve the interests of the workers or the capitalists, and that because workers and employers, tenants and landlords are inherently in conflict with each other, fundamentally, the state can either suppress the interests of the workers or it can suppress the interests of the capitalists. That by definition, though, is going to serve the interests of one class or another. And the Marxists believe that the structure and the form of the government is the problem, but not the idea of governments and states themselves. And thus, the socialist philosophy in this regard is a belief that we need to fundamentally restructure our government, to change it so that it serves the interests of workers, to suppress capitalist exploitation. That our system of democracy needs to be restructured in a way that is truly democratic, and that our economy should also be democratized at the same time. It's not that all states are inherently bad and incapable of doing good. It's that the form our state has taken, the structure, is designed to support the wealthiest as opposed to the most marginalized. That it's designed to support capitalists and not workers. And that if we form a state that supports the interests of workers, things will actually start to get better. But the reason why I think these things are important to understand is just because somebody will agree that the government isn't working for working class people doesn't mean they're necessarily going to go along the right path when it comes to solving the problem. But the reason why I think it's important to understand this is just because somebody says they think the government's not doing a good enough job doesn't mean that they have the same solutions as you. And just because somebody says that they think the government should work for working class people doesn't mean that they're really on the same side as you either.